So, the 2023 Formula One season has come to an end, and there are many words that can be used to describe it. Close is not one of them. Red Bull scored double the points of Mercedes in second. They won 21 out of 22 Grand Prix, and Max Verstappen had arguably the most successful season in 73 years of Formula One racing. They set so many records that they broke the record for most records broken in a season. It was a landslide of dominance that F1 has never seen before, even with the F2002 and even with the MP4-4. So let's look back, way back, to the polar opposite of this season. The closest constructors fight of all time, a fight that took place during one of F1's most important seasons, 1958. As Formula One entered its 9th season, organizers had a few changes to make. First, the Suez Crisis was over, which allowed the return of the Dutch and Belgian Grand Prix, bringing the total number of races up from 8 to 10. The races themselves were also shorter, with a 300-kilometer or 2-hour-long cap being introduced, something still followed today. A Constructors' Championship was now included, as before only drivers were competing for championship points. Now the teams that they drove for also could challenge for a title. And finally, ethanol fuels were replaced with gasoline. Now this caused a problem for a few teams, since the ethanol fuel is what allowed their large displacement cars to work properly. So let's start off looking at the competition with one of those teams that was screwed by the fuel rules. Vanwall. Vanwall was created by Tony van der Wel, a wealthy metal bearings industrialist, in 1954. And it's sort of a who's who of early British F1 engineering. The early cars were built by future F1 team Cooper, and they were designed by Colin Chapman from Lotus and Frank Costin, the brother of Cosworth's co-founder. By 1957, they were making 300 horsepower with the ethanol fuels and took 3 wins that season, with Stirling Moss coming second in the championship. But now, these new engine regulations only got them to 260 horsepower, 30 down on the Ferraris. Speaking of Ferrari, the 246 was the first V6-powered F1 car and weighed just 1,200 pounds thanks to its aluminum bodywork. But it had one downside, shared with the Vanwall. It was front-engined, a downside that Cooper was about to make painfully obvious. John Cooper changed history in 1950 when his mid-engine T12 successfully qualified for the Monaco Grand Prix, and in 1957, Jack Brabham was finishing 6th with the shed-based Cooper cars. The 1958 vehicle, designed by Owen Maddock, had new suspension geometry and a lower-mounted engine, and that hard work paid off. At the season opener in Argentina, Juan Manuel Fangio took pole position in his Maserati and had 5 other Italian cars, but it was Moss who drove his privateer Cooper T43 to victory from 7th on the grid, the first time ever a mid-engine race car won a Formula One Grand Prix. Sure, Fangio put up a good fight, but Moss took control on lap 35 and never looked back. Behind Moss were the Ferrari teammates of Luigi Musso and Mike Hawthorn, respectively, to round out the podium. Notice that I didn't mention Vanwall at all, because their VW5 wasn't ready yet, which meant that Moss drove for a privateer, and their launch was delayed until the next race at Monaco. And with the arrival of Vanwall, Moss, Tony Brooks, and Stuart Evans all went back to work for the correct team this time. And Brooks immediately slapped it on pole position ahead of a BRM and a whole gaggle of Coopers who were unsurprisingly loving the twisty Monaco layout. However, all of the Vanwalls retired with engine failure before the halfway mark, with the only consolation for Moss being that Hawthorn's Ferrari also retired, only scoring 1 point for fastest lap. So instead, Cooper took their 2nd consecutive victory, with Luigi Musso once again finishing 2nd. The Dutch Grand Prix was next, and Vanwall changed their fortunes in qualifying with a 1-2-3. And this time only 2 of them broke down. meaning Moss drove to victory nearly a minute ahead of the two BRMs, with Hawthorn only scoring 2 points and Musso scoring none. Moss jumped into the championship lead with 12 points, while Vanwall began chasing down Ferrari, and Cooper tied with BRM for third at 8 points. The next race was the Indy 500. I'm just kidding, no one considers the 500 as part of F1. So instead we go to Spa, one of the most insane tracks in F1 history. Nowadays it's a death trap. Back then it was just suicidal. 14 kilometers of high-speed corners and no runoff apart from a forest. The Ferraris were in better form, with Hawthorn ahead of Musso ahead of Moss in qualifying. And like most races of this era, it was a race of attrition. But not in the normal sense. No, the attrition happened not just throughout the race, but for all of the finishers as well. Brooks took another Vanwall victory as its gearbox disintegrated across the finish line. Hawthorn finished second by coasting across the line with a broken engine, and Stuart Lewis-Evans limped across in P3 with collapsed suspension, meaning every single car on the podium probably couldn't make it to the podium at all. Hawthorn's second place bumped him up 4 positions in the championship, up to second overall, just 3 points behind Moss, while Ferrari took the championship lead away from Cooper after they DNF'd, and Vanwall continued closing in despite missing the first race of the season. Now, the 1958 French Grand Prix is notable because of its roller coaster ride of emotions in the Ferrari garage. On one side, Mike Hawthorn secured his only Grand Slam by getting pole position, fastest lap, and led every lap to victory lane. Nice going. On the other side, Luigi Musso died at the hospital after an accident. See, he was pushing hard to catch Hawthorn, way too hard, and he went wide off the road and into a ditch. His widow later revealed that the two British drivers of Hawthorn and Peter Collins worked together to win as many races as possible and split the winnings. Musso, because he wasn't British, was not offered in on this deal, and he really needed to win the prize money to pay some debts. But instead he suffered brain injuries and died the next day. So combine Hawthorn's Grand Slam and Moss's third place finish, the two of them were tied on points at the end of race 5, halfway through the season. So Moss and Vanwall were looking for a rebound at their home Grand Prix with a pole position. Pretty good start. But Collins led Hawthorn to a Ferrari 1-2 with Moss retiring from yet another engine failure. So at their home Grand Prix, Ferrari began to steal any hopes of a British championship. But then it was time to head to the Nürburgring Nordschleife. Hawthorn had clutch issues, and even though Moss got fastest lap, he retired as well, ensuring that the championship didn't really go anywhere. Instead, this left it as a 2-horse race between Brooks and Collins. Brooks was leading, with Collins close behind, but in a near carbon copy of Musso's accident, he ran wide trying to catch up, went off the circuit, and somersaulted into the trees. He, too, died the next day in hospital, making him the second Ferrari driver to die in 3 races. Because of this, and the buffer those two had for third, because they were just a class of their own in the field, Brooks and his Vanwall won by over 3 minutes. Then came Portugal, perhaps the most retrospectively important Grand Prix of the season. You see, Moss led from pole position to secure his 3rd win, but Hawthorn got disqualified from second. He had spun off and got back going again by temporarily driving the wrong way on the circuit. The stewards didn't like that at all, and he got disqualified. Now, this would have given Moss the championship lead by 2 points, but being the gentleman he is, he argued in favor of reinstating Hawthorn's position, and his rival in the championship was successfully reinstated for second. This meant, despite winning the race, Moss only gained a single point on the Ferrari driver. There were only 2 races left, and this is an era where you only got 8 points for a win, which meant that he needed to pull something if Moss wanted to win this championship, and the penultimate round was at Ferrari's home turf at Monza. Despite being down on horsepower, the Van Walls were pretty darn fast, taking a front row lockout in qualifying and the win on Sunday. But Moss didn't get to go to victory lane. Instead, Brooks won ahead of Hawthorn, having driven past Moss's broken gearbox. Although, Brooks's win instead of Hawthorn's win meant that Moss was still technically in the championship, but he needed a miracle to win it. Specifically, he needed to win the final race of the season, get fastest lap, and have Hawthorn finish third or lower. Those are a lot of requirements to win, and he actually did his job. He qualified second, just a tenth behind Hawthorn, and then drove off to the win and got fastest lap. He maximized all of his points to get 9 to finish off the season. However, the Ferrari of Phil Hill was in second, and he was ordered to make way for Hawthorn, who took second place, earning 49 points to Moss's 41, taking the F1 World Drivers' Championship. Except, until 1992, Formula 1 had weird rules in which only the best finishes counted towards the title, and in 1958, only the best 6 results counted. So Hawthorn lost points in Zandvoort and Argentina, while Moss had so many retirements that he didn't lose any points at all, meaning the final total was Moss 41, Hawthorn 42. Moss had gone second in the championship for the 3rd time in a row, and in each subsequent season after 1958, he scored 3rd to cement his unfortunate title as the greatest driver never to win the World Championship. Meanwhile, the fight between Van Wall and Ferrari came down to the closest margin in F1 history. Van Wall's win meant that the two of them were tied for first at 57 points apiece, and nowadays ties are determined by the highest number of finishing positions, which would give Van Wall the win since they had 6 victories to Ferrari's 2. They had a really good season that year. However, thanks to the best of 6 rule, Ferrari lost 2 second places, a 4th, and a 5th, while Van Wall lost all of their points except for the very important 6 wins they got, meaning Van Wall scored a nice even 48 points to Ferrari's 40, taking the first ever F1 Constructors' Championship. And it was the last title for a front-engine car, as Cooper and Jack Brabham took back-to-back titles in 1959 and 1960, forcing the stubborn Enzo Ferrari to admit that the front-engine car was done. But the championship was a hollow one for Tony Vanderwell. His driver Stuart Lewis Evans died in the hospital from burns sustained during a crash in the final race of the season caused by a seizing engine. Vanderwell shut the team down, and they were never seen in full season competition again. The same can be said for Mike Hawthorn. He retired as a champion, having seen both of his teammates die behind the wheel, and he soon joined them as just 3 months into his retirement, he died in a car crash while racing his friend down a back road. All of this to say that 1958 has the tragic record of the highest mortality rate in F1 history. 4 out of the 80 drivers, including the Indy 500, died during that season. That's 5% of all drivers died behind the wheel in that year. But that was the accepted risk of the time. If you competed for 5 years, you had a 75% chance of dying. None of these races, not France, not Morocco, none of them were stopped after these fatal accidents. There were no barriers or medical centers or safety cars. It's inexcusable today. But nonetheless, it's interesting that the first ever Constructors' Championship is also the closest. Sure, a few have come down to single digits, but never have they tied on points and required the count back. I wish we could have close titles like this, but as it stands, we probably have to get used to a few more years of Red Bull and Verstappen being, well, Red Bull and Verstappen.